Lions Nations. The Detroit Lions are walking into their final scheduled home game of the 2025 regular season with everything still on the line, and there's no way to sugarcoat what this moment represents. This isn't just another Sunday at Ford Field. This is survival. Over the last 6 weeks, this team has lived inside playoff-level intensity week after week, facing Dallas, then Los Angeles, and now Pittsburgh. Each game has felt like a fork in the road, and this one against the Steelers is no different. A win keeps the Lions breathing, keeps the path alive, keeps hope real. A loss doesn't mathematically eliminate them, but it puts this season on life support, forcing them to rely on a long list of things breaking their way just to stay relevant. That's the reality right now. So leave your like on the video to show your support. What stands out heading into this game is the expectation that the offense, especially at home, is going to respond in a big way. This is the last chance the Ford Field crowd gets to be part of this regular season, and there's a strong belief inside this matchup that the Lions offense is ready to put on a show. Jahmyr Gibbs is right at the center of that conversation. After exploding for 3 touchdowns against the Dallas Cowboys at home, he completely vanished on the road against the Rams. That contrast matters. Tomorrow gives him a chance to reassert himself in front of the home crowd, and not just with a solid performance, but with history within reach. 1 touchdown would put him past Barry Sanders for the most touchdowns scored before the age of 24 in franchise history. That's not a projection or a hypothetical. That's one play away from reality, and everything about this setup points toward Gibbs being heavily involved. But while the offense carries expectation, the defense continues to absorb tough news, and this week delivered clarity that had been hanging over the team for months. The Lions officially placed safety Kerby Joseph on injured reserve, ending his regular season. This didn't come as a surprise based on what we've seen on the field, or rather what we haven't seen. Kerby Joseph hasn't played since October. For more than 2 months, his absence lingered without final resolution, creating constant questions about whether he could return. Now, those questions are gone. His regular season is officially over. The timing of this move raises frustration because it feels long overdue. The Lions had roster flexibility earlier in the year and used injured reserve elevations and opportunities to manage this situation differently. Instead, Joseph stayed in limbo while the secondary adjusted week after week without him. Dan Campbell already told us this was a lingering knee issue, something that wasn't going to magically heal, something Joseph may have to manage for the rest of his career. Some around the league even view it as potentially career-altering. Whether that ends up being true or not, the important part is this: the Lions now know where they stand. Along with Joseph going to injured reserve, the Lions activated offensive lineman Christian Mahogany from injured reserve and elevated Kingsley and tight end Giovanni Ricci from the practice squad to the active roster. These are moves that speak to depth, availability, and readiness, not splash or star power. It's also worth noting that Tom Kennedy remains on the 53-man roster and did not need elevation, while Amon-Ra St. Brown has not been elevated even once, which raises quiet questions about roster usage and priorities as the season winds down. The bigger picture, though, is impossible to ignore. Both of the Lions' starting safeties are now on injured reserve. The 2025 regular seasons are over. That's not a small thing. That's a massive hit to the back end of the defense, and it's happened in a year where the margin for error is already thin. Still, there's a line that can't be crossed anymore, and that line is excuses. Injuries are part of the NFL. Every team deals with them. The Lions aren't unique in that regard. Other contenders have lost star players and stayed competitive. At this point, preparation and adaptation matter more than explanations. Placing Kerby Joseph on injured reserve finally closes one chapter and opens another. The uncertainty is gone. The Lions can stop waiting and start adjusting with clarity. Whether that means internal replacements, short-term solutions, or simply surviving week to week remains to be seen. What's clear is that this move signals acceptance of reality, and sometimes that's the hardest step in a season like this. So with the Steelers coming to town, playoff hopes hanging in the balance, Jahmyr Gibbs chasing history, and the secondary officially reshaped by injury, how do you feel about the Lions finally placing Kerby Joseph on injured reserve and what it means for the rest of this season? What this move really does, more than anything else, is force the Lions to stop living in the gray area. There are no more what-ifs with Kerby Joseph. There is no more weekly speculation about whether this is the game he comes back, or whether the knee suddenly responds differently. The Lions have drawn a line under it. If they make the playoffs, there is still uncertainty about whether injured reserve timelines even allow him to return. But based strictly on what we know right now, this feels like a season-ending decision. And that matters, because planning changes once uncertainty is removed. Kerby Joseph's absence hasn't just been about losing a starter. It's been about losing stability. When he was on the field, this secondary had communication, range, and a safety who could erase mistakes. Without him, the Lions have been patching together solutions, leaning on depth players, and asking others to do more than originally planned. Now, with both starting safeties on injured reserve, the situation becomes undeniable. This is no longer bad luck or short-term damage control. This is a full-season reality that has to be navigated with what's left in the room. The frustration from the fan base is understandable, especially considering how long this decision took. Kerby Joseph hadn't played since October. The Lions knew the knee wasn't improving. Dan Campbell said it himself, calling it a lingering issue that would not heal on its own. When that's the diagnosis, delaying injured reserve only prolongs confusion. The benefit of finally making the move is that the team can now open a roster spot, evaluate depth properly, and move forward without guessing. That doesn't fix the problem, but it does make the problem clearer. This also forces a larger conversation about how the Lions have handled injuries and depth this season. At this stage, there's no room left for leaning on injury narratives. Every team is dealing with it. The Lions are not alone, and they're not uniquely unlucky. What separates teams in December is preparation and resilience, not health. The Lions have reached the point where the standard has to be execution, regardless of who's missing. There are no more safety nets. At the same time, it's impossible not to acknowledge how much Kerby Joseph is missed. He had a strong season last year, earned his contract, and was a core part of the defensive identity. Losing him isn't just losing snaps, it's losing a tone setter on the back end. The hope now shifts away from return timelines and toward long-term outlook. The question becomes whether this knee issue is something he can manage, similar to how Frank Ragnow has played through a chronic condition, or whether it limits him moving forward. That answer won't come this season. As the Lions head into this final stretch, everything compresses. Every snap matters. Every decision matters. The margin for error is gone. This team is fighting with its back against the wall, and historically, that's when they've shown their best football. The Steelers' game isn't just about playoff math. It's about proving that this roster, even battered, can still respond when clarity replaces uncertainty. Now the focus shifts entirely to execution. The offense carrying its weight, the defense surviving and adapting, the coaching staff making the right calls with the personnel available. There's no waiting anymore. There's no hoping someone returns just in time. This is the team the Lions have, and this is the moment they have to face head on. What adds another layer to all of this is how this situation reflects where the Lions are as an organization right now. This isn't a rebuilding team anymore. This isn't a roster being evaluated for the future while wins are secondary. Every decision is supposed to be about winning now, and that's why the delay with Kerby Joseph felt so jarring to a lot of fans. When a team is contending, clarity is currency. You need to know exactly who you can count on, exactly who is unavailable, and exactly how to build around that reality. Dragging out uncertainty doesn't just affect the depth chart, it affects preparation, game planning, and confidence. The secondary, in particular, has taken hit after hit this season, and it has forced the Lions to expose areas that were never meant to be stressed this heavily. Communication breakdowns, missed assignments, and conservative coverages haven't happened in a vacuum. They're symptoms of a unit that's been constantly reshuffled. When both starting safeties are gone, the margin for disguise disappears. You simplify, you protect, and you hope your front seven can do enough to prevent quarterbacks from exploiting the back end. That's a dangerous way to live in December, especially when every opponent is fighting for something. This is where the spotlight naturally turns to the front office and the coaching staff. Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell have earned credibility, but credibility doesn't eliminate scrutiny. At this point, the roster is what it is. There are no miracle fixes coming. Any additions are going to be depth moves, not difference makers. That means development, scheme, and discipline have to carry the load. The Lions can't afford mental mistakes. They can't afford blown coverages. They can't afford slow starts. Everything has to be cleaner, sharper, and more intentional than it has been. At the same time, this moment is also an opportunity. Seasons like this define teams, not when everything goes right, but when things stack against you and you're forced to respond without excuses. The Lions still control one important thing: their effort and execution. A win against the Steelers doesn't just keep playoff hopes alive, it sends a message that this team can still punch back when the narrative starts to turn. It reminds everyone, including the locker room, that this season isn't finished yet. Kerby Joseph's situation is painful, frustrating, and unresolved long-term, but at least it's no longer ambiguous. The Lions know he's not walking through that door during the regular season. Now the question is whether the rest of the roster can stabilize enough to compensate for what's been lost. That answer is coming quickly, and it's coming under pressure. There's also a psychological side to this that doesn't always show up on the stat sheet, but every team feels it. When a player like Kerby Joseph goes down and stays in limbo for weeks, it creates a quiet tension inside the locker room. Teammates don't just see a name on the injury report, they see a guy rehabbing every day, trying to push through something that isn't responding. Eventually, reality sets in. When the injured reserve move finally comes, it's not relief, but it is closure. Players can mentally move on. Coaches can stop planning contingencies that never materialize. The team can settle into a version of itself that, while imperfect, is at least defined. That definition is critical now because the Lions are entering a stretch where every opponent understands exactly how fragile the margins are. Nobody is taking it easy. Nobody is experimenting. Every offense is hunting mismatches, and every defense is trying to disguise weaknesses. For Detroit, the challenge is surviving in the secondary without overcompensating. When you start playing scared, when you start calling coverages simply to avoid getting beat deep, you give up everything underneath. That's when long drives happen, time of possession swings, and games slip away slowly. The Lions can't afford that kind of death by inches. This puts even more pressure on complementary football. The offense has to sustain drives. Field position has to matter. Turnovers become non-negotiable. If the defense can't dominate, it has to be opportunistic. That's how teams survive December football when talent gaps start to show. And that's why the Steelers game feels so important beyond the standings. It's a test of whether this team can still function as a unit when one side of the ball is clearly compromised. It also brings the conversation back to expectations. Earlier in the season, the Lions were measured against the best versions of themselves. Now, they're being measured against reality. That doesn't mean standards disappear. It means standards shift from dominance to resilience, from controlling games to surviving them, from style points to results. That's not glamorous, but it's honest football. Kirby Joseph's year ending this way is part of a larger story about how quickly momentum can change in the NFL. One season you're ascending, the next you're managing attrition. The Lions are learning that in real time. What matters now isn't how they got here, but how they respond while they're here. There's still a path forward, but it's narrow, unforgiving, and demands near-perfect execution. This is the part of the season where teams reveal who they really are. Not on paper, not in projections, but snap by snap under pressure. The Lions are about to show whether they can absorb another blow and keep moving, or whether the weight finally becomes too much. Another element that can't be ignored is how moments like this shape the identity of a season in hindsight. Years from now, people won't remember every stat line or every injury report detail, but they will remember whether this team folded or fought. The Lions are now in the phase where reputation is built in real time. Around the league, teams are watching how Detroit responds to adversity. Do they stay disciplined when shorthanded, or do mistakes compound once pressure rises? That answer carries beyond just this season. For the younger players in the secondary, this stretch is a trial by fire. There's no easing into responsibility anymore. Every snap is meaningful, every target is intentional, and quarterbacks will test them early and often. This is where preparation during the week matters more than raw talent. Film study, communication, trust between teammates, those are the things that prevent one injury from turning into a collapse. The Lions don't need perfection back there, but they do need cohesion. Confusion is fatal in December. It also forces the coaching staff to be brutally honest about what they can and cannot do schematically. There's a temptation to overcorrect when injuries pile up, to reinvent instead of refine. That usually backfires. The smarter approach is tightening the margins, simplifying responsibilities, and letting players play fast rather than think. If the Lions can do that, they give themselves a chance every week, even if the matchup isn't ideal on paper. What makes this stretch so compelling is that the Lions are still in control of their effort. The math may be tight, the path may be narrow, but nothing has been taken from them yet. They are still alive. That matters. Teams that are truly finished don't have meaningful December football. Detroit still does, and with that comes pressure, but also opportunity. Kirby Joseph's situation symbolizes the cost of a long season. It's the reminder that talent alone doesn't guarantee availability, and availability often matters just as much. His absence hurts, there's no denying that, but it doesn't automatically decide the season. That decision will come from how the rest of the roster responds, how the leaders lead, and how the team handles moments when things don't go according to script. This is where belief either hardens or cracks. Not the loud kind, but the quiet belief that shows up on third down, in red zone defense, and late in games when fatigue sets in. The Lions are being asked to find that version of themselves now, not later. At this point in the season, the conversation naturally shifts from possibilities to accountability. Not in a blame-driven way, but in an honest one. Everyone in the building understands the stakes now. There's no cushion left. Every missed tackle, every blown assignment, every stalled drive carries more weight than it did in September. And that's why moments like the Kirby Joseph injured reserve decision linger. They're not just roster transactions, they're signals. Signals that the Lions are done waiting, done hoping something changes on its own, and are now forced to confront exactly who they are with what they have. For the veterans in that locker room, this stretch becomes a leadership test. Words don't matter much right now. What matters is how practice is run, how details are emphasized, and how quickly mistakes are corrected. Younger players look to see who steadies the room when pressure peaks. They notice who stays locked in and who drifts. That internal dynamic often decides games before kickoff ever happens. From a fan perspective, this is also where patience and frustration collide. You can acknowledge the injuries, understand the context, and still demand better execution. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. The Lions are past the stage where effort alone is enough. They need precision. They need discipline. They need to avoid beating themselves, especially against teams that thrive on capitalizing on mistakes. The Steelers don't need gifts. If Detroit gives them short fields or coverage busts, they will make them pay. What keeps this season compelling, though, is that none of this has erased the fight. You can question decisions, critique timing, and worry about depth, but you can't say this team has stopped competing. That matters. Teams that quit don't stay in the playoff picture this late. Teams that quit don't play meaningful football in December. The Lions are still here, still in the conversation, still with something to prove. Kirby Joseph's absence is now part of the story, not the whole story. It's a chapter, not the ending. The ending is still unwritten, and it will be decided by how the Lions respond when the margin for error disappears entirely. These are the weeks that define seasons and shape legacies, for better or worse. When you zoom out even further, this stretch also exposes how thin the line really is between a season that feels promising and one that feels unfinished. The Lions didn't suddenly become a different team overnight. What changed was availability, margin,